In the late 1930s, the world looked steadier than it felt. Economies were fragile, old alliances creaked, and private conversations in capitals carried the weight of decisions that would soon reshape continents. On August 23, 1939, two unlikely powers signed a non-aggression pact that stunned diplomats. Behind the public face of agreement lay secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. 1 week later, on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. That invasion was not a single moment, but the opening move of a broader plan to redraw borders by force. Within days, the map of Europe began to change in ways most people could not imagine. Throughout 1940, countries that had hoped the storm would pass found themselves swept up instead. In May and June, a lightning campaign overran the Low Countries and France in little more than a month, toppling governments and sending millions into exile or occupation. Across the Channel, Britain braced for a new kind of assault, not by armies on the ground, but by aircraft in the sky. From July through October 1940, the island endured sustained raids, while pilots and civilians alike learned the cost of standing alone. Farther afield, fragile balances in Asia were collapsing too. By the end of 1941, a single, devastating surprise attack would draw a new power fully into the conflict, turning a mainly European war into a truly global one. This is the moment our story begins, not with sudden lightning, but with a world already charged, treaties inked, armies mobilizing, and ordinary lives inching toward extraordinary upheaval. If you'd like to follow this timeline step by step, subscribe now and keep the lights low. We'll move slowly, clearly, and chronologically through each major event so you can listen, learn, and drift to sleep. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, Europe crossed an invisible line it had spent 2 decades trying to avoid. At dawn, when most of the continent still slept, engines roared across borders, artillery opened fire, and radio operators tapped out messages that would echo across history. This was not simply another military campaign. This was the moment the Second World War began. But to understand why the invasion of Poland became the spark that ignited a global conflict, we must step back into the fragile late 1930s when diplomacy had cracks, alliances were uncertain, and rising powers quietly prepared for confrontation. After the First World War ended in 1918, Europe had hoped that treaties and new borders would establish long-lasting peace. Instead, those same treaties left bitterness, economic strain, and unresolved territorial disputes. Germany, in particular, carried deep resentment from the Treaty of Versailles, which had stripped land, limited its army, and placed the blame for the previous war squarely on its shoulders. By the mid-1930s, Germany was no longer the weakened republic it had been. Under Adolf Hitler, the country rapidly rearmed, reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and dismantled neighboring Czechoslovakia piece by piece. Each step violated international agreements. Each step tested how far other nations would go to stop expansion. And each step revealed a deeper truth. Europe was not prepared to confront a determined aggressor. Poland, positioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, understood its vulnerability. It had regained independence only in 1918, after more than a century of being divided by empires. Its borders, though restored, were not universally accepted. One particular issue, the Polish Corridor, a strip of land granting Poland access to the Baltic Sea, left part of Germany, East Prussia, separated from the rest of the country. Along with the port city of Danzig, this corridor became a focal point of German nationalist anger.
Through 1938 and 1939, Germany increased pressure on Poland, demanding territorial concessions and transport rights across Polish land. Poland refused. The Polish government believed that agreeing to such demands would weaken its sovereignty and only encourage future claims. Meanwhile, Britain and France had grown alarmed by Germany's unchecked expansion. So in March 1939, they issued formal guarantees to Poland, promising to support its independence. Germany, however, had already set its plans in motion. On August 23, 1939, a diplomatic bombshell shook the world. Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that stunned foreign ministries across Europe. Hidden within the pact were secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, wedged between the two powers, found itself split on paper before a single shot had been fired. With the Soviet threat temporarily neutralized, Germany gained what it needed: the freedom to attack Poland without fear of a two-front war. Preparations accelerated. Troops massed along the border. Aircraft were positioned on forward airfields. Propaganda campaigns painted Poland as a hostile, unreasonable neighbor. And at 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the first German shots were fired. One of the earliest and most symbolic acts occurred on the Baltic coast. A German battleship anchored in the harbor of Danzig opened fire on a Polish military depot at Westerplatte. Explosions echoed across the shoreline, and smoke rose over the trees as Polish defenders scrambled to their positions. Further inland, the German army surged forward with tanks and mechanized infantry. This rapid, coordinated movement, later known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, focused on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Poland's defenses were not outdated, as some myths suggest, but they were geographically spread out and not prepared for such concentrated assaults. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, struck military bases, rail lines, communication centers, and sometimes civilian areas, creating chaos. Within hours, Poland's ability to coordinate a unified defense was strained. Trains carrying soldiers were destroyed before reaching the front. Roads clogged with refugees. Command posts went silent. Despite this, Polish resistance was fierce. Units fought stubbornly in forests, around rivers, and near fortified positions. The cavalry, contrary to popular misunderstanding, did not charge tanks with swords. Instead, these mobile mounted troops acted as rapid-moving infantry, using their speed to outmaneuver slower enemy units. In several early battles, Polish forces halted or even repelled German assaults, but these moments could not shift the broader trajectory of the campaign. The fall of the city of Łódź, the encirclement near Pomerania, and the brutal fighting along the Vistula River all showed the scale of the challenge Poland faced. By early September, German armored divisions were closing in from the north, west, and south, threatening to surround large segments of the Polish army. Strategic withdrawals became necessary, but retreat under constant air attack turned many movements into desperate escapes. On September 9th, Poland attempted a counterattack near the Brzura River in one of the largest battles of the campaign. For a moment, momentum shifted. Several German divisions were pushed back, supply lines disrupted, and communication networks damaged. But German air superiority once again proved decisive. Repeated bombing runs broke the counterattack, and by mid-September, the Polish resistance had been forced back toward Warsaw. Meanwhile, international responses were unfolding. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, fulfilling their pledge to defend Poland. Yet these declarations did not translate into immediate military action on the battlefield. The Western Front remained quiet, and Poland fought almost entirely alone. German forces, free from pressure elsewhere, tightened their grip. Then, on September 17th, a new shock struck. The Soviet Union,
acting on the secret terms of its pact with Germany, invaded Poland from the east. Polish defenses, already pressured on three sides, could not withstand a second invasion. Leaders decided to evacuate government officials and military units toward the Romanian border, hoping to continue the struggle from abroad. For many soldiers and civilians, the dual invasions marked the collapse of any remaining hope for a coordinated defense. Warsaw, however, refused to surrender easily. The city endured intense bombardment as German artillery and aircraft targeted defensive positions and infrastructure. Fire spread across neighborhoods. Food supplies dwindled. Still, defenders held on for nearly 3 weeks. But by September 27th, after suffering immense losses and facing overwhelming odds, the city capitulated. In the days that followed, remaining pockets of resistance were gradually subdued.
By early October, organized Polish resistance inside the country had been largely broken. Germany annexed large portions of western Poland, incorporating them directly into the Third Reich. The eastern regions fell under Soviet control. The rest of Poland became the so-called general government, an occupied territory administered by German authorities. What followed was not simply occupation, but the beginning of harsh repression, forced labor, cultural destruction, and eventually some of the darkest chapters of human history. Yet while the military campaign ended quickly, the spirit of Polish resistance did not. Government officials who escaped abroad established a government in exile, eventually based in London. Polish pilots later played critical roles in air battles over Britain. Soldiers regrouped to fight alongside Allied forces in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. Inside occupied Poland, underground networks, among the largest in Europe, formed to resist German rule, gather intelligence, and protect civilians. The invasion had crushed the state, but not the national identity. For Germany, the invasion of Poland marked a turning point. It demonstrated the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics and boosted confidence among military leaders. But it also set off a chain reaction that Germany could not fully control. Britain and France were now at war. Economic blockades would slowly tighten, and what began as a rapid military victory soon grew into a conflict stretching across continents and lasting 6 brutal years. For Europe, the invasion was the final signal that peace had ended. Treaties, negotiations, and diplomatic compromises had all failed. The international system built after the First World War collapsed under the weight of aggression and mistrust. As German troops celebrated early victories, few could imagine the scale of destruction that lay ahead. For millions of civilians, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Families fled burning villages, cities were reduced to rubble. Thousands were killed in the initial bombardments, and the occupation that followed brought mass arrests, deportations, and the early foundations of crimes that would later define the war's moral horror. The invasion was not only a military event, it was the beginning of an era marked by suffering, displacement, and survival. The story of the invasion of Poland is essential not because it explains everything, but because it shows how quickly the world can change when power, fear, and ambition collide. A conflict that began at dawn on September 1st, 1939, in a country caught between empires, soon engulfed cities across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and both oceans. What happened in those first weeks reshaped alliances, awakened sleeping nations, and led directly to the global mobilization that followed. In the early months of 1940, Europe stood suspended between uncertainty and fear. The previous autumn had erupted with the shock of Poland's rapid defeat, but after that violent beginning, the Western Front settled into a tense and deceptive calm. Newspapers called it the phony war. Civilians wondered whether the conflict might somehow stay contained. Politicians whispered that perhaps diplomacy could still intervene. But inside military headquarters, the mood was far more sober. Strategists understood that Germany had gained momentum,
resources, and a dangerous sense of confidence. What Adolf Hitler planned next would decide whether the continent collapsed nation by nation or whether the Allies found a way to halt the expanding storm. Through the winter of 1939 to 1940, German commanders refined a plan that revised old assumptions about geography and military tradition. In the First World War, the Western Front had been dominated by trenches, fortified lines, and slow attritional battles. France still trusted in that idea, relying on the Maginot Line, an immense chain of bunkers, tunnels, and armored outposts stretching along its border with Germany. It was a monument to the belief that the next war would resemble the last one. But German planners saw something else, a chance to avoid the old stalemate entirely by striking through unexpected terrain and exploiting speed rather than raw manpower. The Ardennes forest, sitting between France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, had long been considered impassable for major armored operations. Its steep ravines, dense foliage, and narrow roads convinced Allied generals that tanks simply could not maneuver effectively there. Germany disagreed. Generals like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian championed a new approach: concentrated mechanized thrusts, bypassing strongpoints and driving deep into enemy territory to collapse defenses from within. Hitler approved this bold strategy, and during the winter months, German forces prepared meticulously, shifting divisions, assembling armored spearheads, and coordinating air support that would ensure dominance in the skies. While Germany refined its plans in the west, the north grew restless. Denmark and Norway, though officially neutral, were strategically significant. Norway's long coastline, fjords, and access to the North Atlantic made it essential for controlling naval routes. Most importantly, Norway served as a lifeline for Swedish iron ore shipments.
During winter months, when the Baltic Sea froze, Germany relied on Norwegian ports, especially Narvik, to import the raw materials necessary to fuel its arms industry. British leaders recognized the danger of allowing this supply chain to remain intact. They considered mining Norwegian waters or occupying key ports preemptively, but hesitated repeatedly, fearing international backlash or escalating the conflict beyond control. Germany did not hesitate. On April 9, 1940, German forces launched Operation Weserübung, a coordinated invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a matter of hours, facing overwhelming military disadvantage and determined to avoid civilian casualties. Danish leaders surrendered quickly. Norway resisted more fiercely. German paratroopers landed at key airfields, naval vessels attempted to seize coastal cities, and the Luftwaffe targeted communication centers. Though British and French forces arrived to support Norway, their efforts were disorganized and ultimately insufficient. German control of the air made sustained defense nearly impossible. By early June, Norwegian resistance ended and the occupation consolidated. Germany now held the northern high ground and secured its vital iron ore imports. If Europe had hoped the war might remain localized or slow-moving, the events in Norway dispelled that illusion. The Northern Campaign demonstrated Germany's willingness to strike neutral nations, its mastery of combined air, land, sea operations, and its strategic hunger for resources. The British government, shaken by the failure in Norway, saw internal turmoil. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned, replaced by Winston Churchill, a man who had warned for years that complacency in the face of German aggression would prove disastrous. Yet even as Britain reshuffled leadership, the next blow was already forming. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its massive offensive across Western Europe. The attack unfolded with extraordinary speed. German forces surged into the Netherlands and Belgium,
triggering precisely the reaction they expected. The Allies, believing these nations to be the main target, just as in 1914, sent their best mobile divisions northward, including advanced armored units and the elite British Expeditionary Force. It was a logical response. Belgium and the Netherlands were essential defensive buffers, and their fall would expose northern France.
But while Allied forces moved north, the main German strike force began pushing through the Ardennes, the very region deemed impractical for a large-scale invasion. The forest slowed them, but not enough to break the plan. Once German tanks emerged from the wooded terrain, they found lightly defended positions. Allied intelligence had not expected a concentrated armored push through this region, and the result was catastrophic. Within days, German forces broke through Allied lines and raced toward the English Channel. They aimed not at Paris, not yet, but at severing the connection between the northern Allied armies and the rest of France. As the German spearheads advanced, they created a widening pocket of trapped Allied troops. Communication failures, conflicting orders, and the sheer speed of German movements sowed confusion among French and British commanders. The Luftwaffe intensified the chaos, bombing roads, bridges, and supply columns. Refugees fleeing westward clogged escape routes, making military maneuvers even more difficult. The psychological shock was immense. The belief that Allied numbers and defensive lines could hold back an invasion evaporated almost instantly. By mid-May, German armored divisions reached the Channel coast, effectively cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and several French units from the bulk of Allied forces. The trapped soldiers retreated toward the small port of Dunkirk. Under relentless pressure, they formed a shrinking perimeter around the beaches. Winston Churchill, newly appointed and aware that losing these troops would cripple Britain's ability to continue the war, ordered an immediate evacuation. What followed became one of the most dramatic and desperate operations of the war, the Dunkirk evacuation, Operation Dynamo. From May 26th to June 4th, a flotilla of warships, merchant vessels, fishing boats, and countless civilian craft crossed the English Channel repeatedly, while German forces bombed the beaches and surrounding towns. Conditions were chaotic, but the effort succeeded beyond expectation. Over 330,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated to Britain. Military historians continued debating the reasons Germany did not crush the trapped forces outright, citing Luftwaffe limitations, confusion in command, or a strategic pause ordered by Hitler. Whatever the cause, the escape allowed Britain to preserve a core fighting force. But the evacuation, however remarkable, could not reverse the broader collapse. After Dunkirk, Germany turned south, driving deeper into France. French forces, demoralized and overwhelmed by the speed of the assault, could not mount a coordinated defense. The Maginot Line, bypassed rather than attacked, stood as a quiet monument to outdated assumptions. On June 10th, Italy, seeking to join what it believed would be a quick and decisive victory, declared war on a France already collapsing. German troops pushed toward Paris, encountering scattered resistance, but little capable of slowing the advance. On June 14th, Paris fell. The French government relocated, deliberated, and eventually authorized negotiations. By June 22nd, France signed an armistice with Germany. The terms divided France into occupied and unoccupied zones. Northern and western regions, strategically vital for controlling the coast and transportation, fell under German occupation. The southeastern zone became the seat of the Vichy government, ostensibly independent but collaborating extensively with German authorities. Marshal Philippe Pétain, a World War I hero, now presided over a state symbolizing defeat and reluctant cooperation. The speed of France's collapse stunned the world. Few had imagined that one of Europe's largest armies could fall in just 6 weeks. Germany's reputation transformed overnight, from a rising military power to a near-invincible war machine. Blitzkrieg, once an untested theory, became the defining expression of modern warfare. The morale effect across Europe was profound. Neutral states reconsidered their positions. Occupied nations grappled with the realities of German rule. Resistance movements began forming quietly, and Britain stood alone. Across the English Channel, a new chapter began. German leaders expected Britain to sue for peace. After all, its army had barely escaped annihilation. Much of its equipment had been abandoned on French soil, and its allies on the continent were defeated. Yet Britain did not yield. Churchill delivered speeches that rallied public resolve, declaring that Britain would fight on the seas and oceans, on the beaches, in the fields, and in the streets. We shall never surrender. Hitler now faced a choice. He could attempt a direct invasion Britain or try to force its submission through air dominance and naval blockade. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, required control of the skies. Without it, transporting troops across the Channel would be suicide. Thus, the stage was set for the next major confrontation, the air campaign that would define Britain's survival and Germany's next strategic move. But in mid-1940, that future battle had not yet begun. For now, the story was Europe's sudden collapse. Beyond the battlefield, Axis expansion reshaped politics and daily life. In occupied nations such as Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, German administrators reorganized economies to support the war effort. Raw materials, industrial output, and agricultural products were redirected to feed the German military machine. Curfews, press censorship, and surveillance became part of everyday existence. In Poland, annexed regions endured brutal oppression. The occupation intensified into systematic repression, targeting political leaders, intellectuals, and entire communities. Germany's victories also emboldened its allies. Italy, motivated by ambition and the desire to share in territorial gains, acted more aggressively in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Japan, observing events from afar, saw opportunity in the shifting global balance, calculating how European distractions might strengthen its own position in Asia.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, expanded its influence as well. In 1940, the Red Army occupied the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and pressed territorial claims against Finland and Romania. The shadow of totalitarian expansion stretched across both halves of Eastern Europe, leaving small nations with few avenues for help or resistance. What made 1940 so devastating was not merely the number of countries affected, but the speed of their fall. Nations with centuries of history collapsed in weeks. Governments fled or capitulated. Borders vanished. Millions of civilians found themselves suddenly living under foreign rule. Each collapse added new resources, territories, and strategic advantages to the Axis powers, creating a sense that the conflict was spiraling toward a single outcome: total Axis dominance. Yet such dominance was never inevitable. Beneath the surface of occupation, resistance networks began forming. In France, clandestine groups gathered intelligence, organized sabotage, and helped downed Allied pilots escape. In the Netherlands and Belgium, underground newspapers circulated secretly. In Norway, resistance fighters monitored German naval movements. Despite their differences, these movements shared a common belief: liberation, however distant, was worth the risk. As summer turned to autumn in 1940, Europe was transformed beyond recognition. The rapid expansions of the Axis powers reshaped geography, politics, and strategy. Germany now dominated the continent from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees.
It controlled major ports, railways, industrial centers, and food supplies. Its armies, tested and victorious, seemed unstoppable. Many in neutral countries feared that resistance was futile. But beneath that surface of dominance lay structural vulnerabilities. Germany had expanded so quickly that managing occupied territories posed immense logistical challenges. Supply lines stretched across vast distances. The Luftwaffe, though powerful, was not limitless. The German Navy remained relatively weak compared to Britain's Royal Navy, and most importantly, Britain refused to surrender. Hitler believed that if Britain could be neutralized, either through negotiation or destruction, Germany could consolidate its hold on Europe. But Britain's survival would shape the next stages of the war. It would determine whether the Axis empire remained continental or expanded across seas and oceans. It would influence whether the United States increased support for the Allies, and it would decide whether the war shifted from regional destruction to a truly global conflict. The fall of nations in 1940 marked the high tide of Axis expansion in Europe. It demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of Germany's military innovations and the consequences of strategic miscalculations by the Allies. But it also set the stage for the fierce resistance, strategic missteps, and escalating global engagement that would eventually turn the tide. In hindsight, 1940 appears not only as a year of collapse, but as a moment when the shape of the entire war crystallized. The rapid conquest of Western Europe revealed the fragility of old systems and the ferocity of modern mechanized warfare. It showed that neutrality offered no guaranteed safety. It exposed how quickly borders, governments, and lives could be overturned. And it marked the beginning of a long, brutal struggle in which liberation would require years of sacrifice, courage, and international resolve. As the echoes of artillery faded over Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen, the world understood that a new and darker era had begun. Europe had fallen, piece by piece, under the weight of Axis ambition. But the war was far from over. Britain, battered but unbroken, stood defiant across the Channel. The next phase of the conflict, the battle for air supremacy and the fight for survival, was about to begin. And from the ashes of defeat, seeds of resistance were quietly taking root in every occupied nation. In the summer of 1940, Europe appeared almost completely in the grip of the Axis powers. Nation after nation had fallen to rapid German expansion. Paris was occupied, the Low Countries subdued, Scandinavia overrun, and the last major continental army had collapsed in defeat. The only remaining Allied power in Western Europe was the United Kingdom, battered, isolated, and standing alone on an island that now seemed like the final barrier between Hitler and total dominance. Yet this small island nation, separated from the continent by a 21-mile stretch of cold water, prepared to face the full force of the most powerful air force in the world. From Berlin, German leaders believed Britain would seek peace. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped from Dunkirk. Much of its heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, had been left behind. German generals expected Britain to calculate that further resistance was futile, but they underestimated something fundamental: the British refusal to negotiate with a regime responsible for so much destruction across Europe. Winston Churchill had risen to power only weeks earlier, and he was determined to continue the fight, regardless of the cost. Hitler preferred avoiding a long war with Britain. His strategic focus lay to the east, where he envisioned future conquests, but Churchill's refusal to negotiate forced him to confront an uncomfortable reality. Before turning toward the Soviet Union, Germany would need either to conquer Britain or neutralize it. A cross-channel invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was drafted. But Germany faced a critical limitation. Without control of the skies over southern England, sending troops across the Channel would be suicidal. German landing craft would be helpless targets for the Royal Navy if the Luftwaffe could not dominate the air. Thus began a campaign unlike anything seen before. Battles would not be fought across trenches, fields, or forests, but high above the clouds, fighter against fighter, bomber against coastal defenses, radar stations, and airfields. If Germany could destroy the Royal Air Force, an invasion might become possible. If the RAF survived, Britain could continue resisting, and the war would stretch into uncertain territory. The opening moves began in early July 1940. The Luftwaffe sought to weaken British coastal defenses, shipping lanes, and radar installations. The Channel became a dangerous battlefield, where German aircraft attacked convoys and probed British responses. Britain's radar network, an innovative chain of early warning stations known as Chain Home, played a vital role from the start. These tall steel towers transmitted signals across the southern coast, detecting incoming aircraft long before they appeared over land. This gave British fighter squadrons precious minutes to climb to altitude and intercept enemy formations. It was a technological advantage Germany had not fully appreciated. As July progressed, preparations for the main assault intensified. Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring believed that overwhelming strength would crush the RAF quickly. Germany possessed hundreds of bombers, Heinkel 111s, Dornier 17s, Junkers 88s, and powerful fighter escorts, the Messerschmitt Bf 109s. They had dominated the skies over Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Britain, however, had something Germany had not truly faced before, a home defense system that combined aircraft, radar, ground observers, and tightly coordinated command centers. At the heart of this system stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the architect of Fighter Command. Dowding understood the limitations of his forces. Britain's primary fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the more advanced Supermarine Spitfire, were formidable aircraft, but there were not enough of them to waste in reckless engagements. Dowding resisted pressure to send large formations to France during the earlier campaign, preserving the core of Fighter Command. Now that decision proved vital. Yet even with this conservation, there were only so many aircraft to defend the entire southern coast. Every loss mattered. The Luftwaffe opened the next phase of the battle on August 13th, Adlertag, or Eagle Day. Hundreds of bombers and fighters swept across the Channel, targeting airfields, radar sites, and command centers. German planners believed that by destroying the RAF's infrastructure and forcing British pilots into constant combat, they could wear down the defenders within weeks. For hours at a time, British squadrons scrambled repeatedly, fighting battle after battle with little rest. Ground crews worked frantically to repair damaged runways, refuel aircraft, and rearm fighters mere minutes before they were ordered back into the sky. The skies above Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire became the front lines of the war. Dogfights twisted above villages, farms, and coastal cliffs. Sometimes duels occurred so high that civilians heard nothing but saw the faint glimmer of sunlight reflecting off metal wings. Other times, battles plunged to treetop height, with bullets scattering across fields, roofs, and roads. Britain's population watched in awe and fear as contrails scribbled chaotic patterns overhead. Despite the intensity of the German assault, Britain's defensive system continued operating. Radar stations damaged on one day were repaired the next. Commanders in protected bunkers monitored radar screens. Telephones rang continually between stations, and fighter controllers vectoring squadrons with remarkable efficiency. Every pilot mattered, not only for skill, but because the RAF could not replace losses as easily as Germany. British pilots flew multiple missions a day, often eating sandwiches between sorties, exhausted but resolute. Still, by late August, the situation was critical. several major airfields had been heavily bombed. Aircraft losses were mounting. Some squadrons had lost half their pilots. Luftwaffe pressure intensified. Goering was convinced victory was close. What he did not fully realize was how close he himself was to achieving strategic success. Britain's aircraft production was strained, and its pilot training was struggling to keep pace with combat losses. One more sustained month of attacks focused purely on airfields and radar might have broken fighter command. Then, in early September, Germany made a decision that changed the course of the battle. After British bombers carried out a small retaliatory strike on Berlin, an attack causing minimal damage but enormous psychological impact, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus from military targets to civilian ones. London became the primary objective. Germany intended to crush British morale, disrupt the capital, and force the government to negotiate. This shift proved to be a profound strategic mistake. The bombings inflicted terrible suffering on civilians and destroyed large sections of London, yet the attacks relieved pressure on the RAF's airfields. Fighter Command used this breathing space to repair runways, reorganize units, and train replacements. Germany's shift from military to civilian targets unintentionally strengthened Britain's ability to fight. As the Blitz against London began, vast formations of German bombers crossed the Channel daily, escorted by Bf-109s flying at the edge of their operational range. British fighters, often operating from bases now fully functional again, intercepted these raids with renewed strength. Hurricanes tore into bomber formations, while Spitfires fought the escorts above. The intensity of these encounters increased into mid-September. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched two massive raids intended to force a decisive break in Britain's defenses. But this time, the RAF was ready. Fighters rose in waves, attacking bomber groups long before they reached London. Ground control teams tracked every formation. By afternoon, the Luftwaffe had suffered significant losses and failed to achieve its objectives. As German formations retreated, Churchill watched from a command post, witnessing the RAF's success firsthand. Germany had expected Britain to collapse. Instead, the defenders had shown resilience unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced. British aircraft production remained strong throughout the battle, eventually outpacing German output. Pilots came not only from Britain, but from occupied nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and from allies like Canada and New Zealand. Their combined efforts created a diverse, determined force united by a common cause, preventing a Nazi invasion. Meanwhile, logistical challenges continued to plague German operations. Bombers suffered from inadequate fighter protection, and escort fighters often had to turn back early because of limited fuel reserves. Coordination between air fleets became strained. The Luftwaffe was designed for rapid assaults in support of ground operations, not for prolonged, independent aerial campaigns. As September ended, German commanders recognized that they had not achieved air superiority. Operation Sea Lion would have to be postponed indefinitely. By October, worsening weather further reduced the intensity of attacks. German bombing continued at night, evolving into the prolonged blitz that would last for months. But the daylight battles that defined the Battle of Britain gradually diminished. The RAF had survived. Britain remained unconquered. For the first time in the war, Hitler suffered a strategic defeat. The significance of the victory cannot be overstated. If Britain had fallen in 1940, Germany would have gained a strategic base for controlling the Atlantic, threatening North America, and isolating the Soviet Union before the war in the East even began. The United States, still neutral, might have hesitated to support a lost cause. Resistance movements in Europe might never have received the backing they needed.
the course of the entire war and of modern history would have been different.
But Britain's survival ensured that Germany would face a prolonged conflict on multiple fronts. It kept alive a staging ground for future Allied operations, including the D-Day invasion 4 years later. It preserved a government and military that would play key roles across the globe, and it proved to occupied nations that resistance was not futile. By the end of 1940, Britain remained under the shadow of nightly bombings, yet it had passed the most critical test. Its air force stood intact. Its people, though battered, had not broken. Its political leadership refused compromise. The island nation that many predicted would surrender had instead weathered the fiercest aerial assault the world had ever seen. The Battle of Britain was not merely an exchange of bombs and bullets. It was a demonstration of technological innovation, strategic foresight, collective resolve, and the courage of thousands of men who flew into danger day after day. It marked the moment when the German war machine, seemingly unstoppable, met its first true limit, and in that limit lay the seeds of a future Allied victory. As Europe continued to tremble under Axis occupation, the skies over Britain told a different story, one in which determination outlasted aggression, and an isolated nation refused to yield to overwhelming force. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer inevitable. For the first time since the conflict began, hope was not a memory, it was a reality. By the end of 1940, Germany stood at the height of its military power in Europe. The fall of France, the defeat of the Low Countries, and the subjugation of Scandinavia had created an arc of Axis-controlled territory stretching from the Arctic to the Pyrenees. Yet despite these victories, Germany had not won the war. Britain remained defiant, resisting from across the Channel. The Battle of Britain had denied Hitler his first major strategic objective, neutralizing the United Kingdom. Now, Germany faced a long conflict with no clear endpoint. It was in this moment that Hitler's gaze shifted eastward, toward the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. This was not a sudden impulse. For years, Hitler had envisioned the conquest of Soviet territory as the cornerstone of his ideology. He saw the lands of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia as essential for securing Germany's long-term economic and strategic future. Within his worldview, this living space was not only desirable but necessary for the rise of a continental empire. The temporary non-aggression pact with Stalin, signed in 1939, had merely been a tool of convenience, a pause before the inevitable clash. While Germany consolidated power in Western Europe, the Soviet Union had also been reshaping its borders. Using the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Soviet forces occupied the Baltic states in 1940, annexed Bessarabia from Romania, and continued to pressure Finland after the Winter War. These expansions made Stalin suspicious in the eyes of his neighbors, but left him confident that Germany would not risk a two-front war. After all, Hitler had tried to avoid such a scenario in the First World War. Yet Stalin underestimated both Hitler's ambitions and the new strategic context that Germany faced in 1940. The failure to subdue Britain created a new calculus in Berlin. Hitler believed that Britain was only holding out in the hope that the Soviet Union or the United States would eventually join the fight. If the Soviet Union fell, he reasoned, Britain's last remaining hope would vanish. Germany could then turn its full attention to the West, or perhaps negotiate a peace on favorable terms. Thus, defeating the Soviet Union became both an ideological imperative and a strategic necessity.
Throughout late 1940, German military planners began drawing the outlines of one of the largest invasions in world history. Operation Barbarossa,
named after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, took shape as a vast, multi-front offensive designed to crush the Soviet Union in a single swift campaign. German generals, many of whom had doubts about the operation, argued for early strikes and deep encirclements to destroy entire Soviet armies before they could retreat into the interior. Germany believed the Soviet Union would collapse like France had. They saw Soviet territory as vast, but its military leadership weakened by Stalin's earlier purges, which had removed or executed thousands of experienced officers. German intelligence estimated that the Red Army was poorly organized, poorly equipped, and incapable of sustained resistance. Reports suggested that Soviet soldiers were demoralized, that supply depots were too close to the border, and that logistics were chaotic. Add to this the assumption that ethnic tensions and political dissatisfaction would fragment Soviet unity once the war began, and German commanders felt confident. But confidence can mask danger, and assumptions can blind even the strongest armies. Hitler underestimated not only the size of the Red Army, but also the Soviet Union's industrial capacity and the resilience of its people. He viewed the Soviet Union through a lens of racial ideology, not military realism. This mistake would echo throughout the war. Despite these flaws, German preparations were extensive. Throughout early 1941, German divisions moved east in waves, disguised as temporary deployments or training exercises. By June, nearly 3 million Axis soldiers, Germans, Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, and volunteers from several occupied nations stood along a frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. This was the largest invasion force ever assembled. The Soviet Union saw these movements but drew the wrong conclusions. Stalin believed Hitler would not break the pact until Britain was defeated. Intelligence reports warning of impending invasion arrived frequently, some from spies, others from diplomats or border patrols. Stalin dismissed most of them, convinced they were British attempts to provoke conflict. Soviet forces were thus caught in a period of transition, reorganizing, rearming, and repositioning, but not yet ready for a massive attack.
On June 22, 1941, just before dawn, the eastern sky lit up with the sound of war. German troops surged across the border, aircraft screamed overhead, and artillery thundered along the entire frontier. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The initial shock was overwhelming. Within hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed hundreds of Soviet aircraft, many on the ground. Communications broke down, commanders struggled to interpret conflicting orders. Some border units fought desperately, while others were encircled before they understood the scale of the invasion. German armored divisions pushed deep into Soviet territory, aiming to create encirclements that would cut off and destroy entire Soviet armies. 3 main German army groups spearheaded the offensive. Army Group North moved toward Leningrad, aiming to link with Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus. Army Group Center drove toward Smolensk and ultimately Moscow, intending to deliver the war's decisive blow. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, targeting its rich agricultural lands and industrial centers. By early July, vast pockets of Soviet soldiers were trapped near Minsk and Bialystok. In these encirclements alone, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured. German commanders were astonished by the scale of their successes. They believed that the Soviet Union was collapsing just as predicted. Newspapers in Berlin reported victory after victory. From a distance, the situation appeared almost identical to the campaigns of 1940. Rapid movement, collapsing defenses, staggering numbers of prisoners. But beneath the surface, the situation was not as clear as German intelligence believed. Soviet losses were immense, but the Red Army did not collapse. Instead, new forces were mobilized, retreating soldiers regrouped. Civilians were ordered to evacuate factories and machinery eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains, where German bombers could not reach.
The Soviet Union was not fighting a 6-week war, it was preparing for a long, grinding struggle. The vastness of the terrain also changed the dynamics of German warfare. Blitzkrieg relied on concentrated force, fast movement, and decisive encirclements. But as armored divisions pushed deeper, supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Roads turned to dust in summer heat and mud in autumn rains. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts lagged behind rapidly advancing units.
Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad by early September. The city, a cultural capital and symbolic heart of the Russian Revolution, refused to surrender. What followed became one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history. German forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies and bombarding it relentlessly. Civilians endured starvation, bitter winters, and unimaginable hardship. Yet Leningrad did not fall. Further south, Army Group Center made rapid progress toward Moscow. By August, Smolensk had been captured, and the road to the Soviet capital lay open. German commanders pressed for a direct assault before winter, but Hitler intervened, redirecting many armored divisions southward to support operations in Ukraine. This decision delayed the advance on Moscow and created debates that continue among historians. Had the original plan continued, could Moscow have fallen before winter? No one can say for certain, but the delay would prove costly. Ukraine, meanwhile, became the scene of some of the largest encirclements in military history. At Kiev, German forces surrounded another massive Soviet grouping. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were killed or captured. The scale of losses defied comprehension. Yet again, the Soviet Union refused to break. Reserves poured in from across the vast nation. New armies formed. Factories in the east resumed production. Germany achieved tactical brilliance but faced strategic exhaustion. By October, the long-awaited offensive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, began. At first, German forces achieved significant gains. Soviet lines buckled and panic spread in the capital. Civilian defenders dug trenches and erected barricades. Government offices prepared evacuation plans. But then, the weather changed. Heavy rains turned roads into rivers of mud, immobilizing tanks and supply trucks. Progress slowed to a crawl. When the ground finally froze, temperatures plummeted. German soldiers, expecting a short campaign, were not equipped for harsh winter. Engines failed, weapons jammed, frostbite spread. Soviet troops, more accustomed to the cold and now receiving reinforcements from Siberia, counterattacked fiercely. In early December, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive outside Moscow. German units, exhausted and exposed, were pushed back from the capital. It was the first major defeat Germany suffered on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its most important objective, the destruction of the Soviet state. Yet the human cost was staggering on both sides. Millions were dead, wounded, or captured. Entire regions lay devastated. Prisoners suffered unspeakable conditions. Civilians endured occupation, reprisals, and starvation. The conflict in the East had become a war not just of armies, but of ideologies, brutal, relentless, and total. By the end of 1941, the war had expanded dramatically. Germany now fought not just Britain and its empire, but the Soviet Union as well. The Axis powers had opened the largest front in history. And in the final days of 1941, another power entered the conflict, the United States, drawn into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. What had begun as a European conflict had now transformed into a truly global war. The invasion of the Soviet Union changed everything. It turned World War II into a massive struggle spanning continents and oceans. It stretched German resources beyond sustainable limits. It awakened the industrial might of the Soviet Union and, eventually, the United States. And it ensured that the war would last far longer, cost far more lives, and reshape the world in ways no one could have foreseen. Throughout the early months of 1941, the world watched Europe burn, unaware that another storm was gathering across the Pacific. While the German invasion of the Soviet Union commanded global attention, a parallel struggle for power, resources, and influence was unfolding thousands of miles away in East Asia. The Pacific region, long overshadowed by European conflicts, was on the brink of an explosion that would draw the United States into the deadliest war in human history. That explosion began with a single event, the attack on Pearl Harbor. To understand why this happened, one must see the deeper tensions that had been building for decades. Japan, a nation with limited natural resources and a rapidly growing industrial economy, had long sought to expand its influence. By the 1930s, Japan viewed control of East Asia not only as a strategic desire, but as an economic necessity. Without access to oil, rubber, iron ore, and other essential materials, its modernized military machine could not function. Japan's wars in China, beginning in 1937, marked the first major step toward regional dominance. Japanese forces captured large cities, seized coastal territories, and established puppet governments. The conflict was brutal, devastating Chinese civilians and reshaping the political landscape. But despite early victories, the war dragged on far longer than Japan expected. Chinese resistance, both nationalist and communist, proved resilient. Japan found itself trapped in a costly quagmire, consuming vast amounts of supplies and manpower. Meanwhile, the United States watched Japan's expansion with increasing alarm. American missionaries, diplomats, and journalists had witnessed the violence in China firsthand, and their reports helped shape public opinion. President Franklin Roosevelt faced a delicate balancing act. The U.S. was officially neutral, yet it sympathized deeply with China. As Japan pushed deeper into the continent, American policymakers saw the balance of power in Asia shifting dangerously. By 1940, tensions escalated dramatically. Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis alliance. This pact transformed Japan from a regional aggressor into part of a larger global coalition opposing the Allied powers. The United States responded by restricting exports of strategic materials, first aviation fuel, then scrap metal, and eventually oil. These sanctions put enormous pressure on Japan. With 80% of its oil imported from the United States, Japan faced a stark choice: retreat from its conquests or secure new resources elsewhere, by force if necessary.
Japan's military leaders chose the latter path. Planning began for a sweeping expansion across Southeast Asia. The region's colonies, controlled by Britain, the Netherlands, and France, held vast oil reserves, rubber plantations, tin mines, and valuable ports. Japan believed that seizing these territories would guarantee its future as a dominant empire. But one obstacle stood in the way: the United States. The American Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, could threaten Japan's southern advance. If Japan moved into Southeast Asia, American warships could intervene, disrupt supply lines, and impose devastating naval blockades. Japan's leaders concluded that only a decisive blow, one that disabled the Pacific Fleet, could give them time to seize resource-rich territories before the United States could recover. Thus emerged a bold, perilous plan: a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though personally skeptical of war with the United States,
understood the strategic logic. He famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but beyond that, he could not guarantee victory. Still, he accepted command of the operation, crafting an audacious strategy that hinged on precision, secrecy, and total surprise. Throughout late 1941, negotiations between Japan and the United States continued, but with little progress. Japan demanded that the U.S. lift sanctions and recognize its dominance in Asia. The United States insisted that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. Neither side would compromise. Diplomacy faded, and the path to conflict widened. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese strike force, 6 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines departed from northern Japan under strict radio silence. Their destination, the Hawaiian Islands. The commanders aboard knew the stakes. If the Americans detected them early, or if weather disrupted flight operations, the mission could fail disastrously. Yet conditions remained favorable, and the fleet moved undetected across the Pacific. Back in Washington and Honolulu, American intelligence agencies intercepted hints of Japanese intentions. Diplomatic messages suggested rising danger, but the specific target remained unknown. Many believed Japan would strike the Philippines, British Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor, though acknowledged as a possibility, was considered unlikely. No one expected an attack 4,000 miles from Japan, one that required extraordinary coordination and logistical skill. On the morning of December 7, 1941, as the sun rose over Oahu, the Japanese strike force prepared for launch. Pilots sat in their cockpits, engines roaring. The first wave of aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, took off from carrier decks and headed toward the unsuspecting American harbor. Below, Pearl Harbor was quiet. It was a Sunday morning. Many sailors were still asleep, others preparing for routine duties. Battleships lined Battleship Row in neat formation. Aircraft at nearby airfields were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, an arrangement that ironically made them perfect targets for air attack. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The attack was swift and devastating. Torpedo bombers skimmed low over the water, striking battleships such as the USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia. Dive bombers plunged from the sky, targeting hangars, fuel depots, and airfields. The USS Arizona suffered a catastrophic explosion when a bomb detonated its forward ammunition magazine. The ship erupted in flames and sank within minutes, taking more than 1,100 men with it. American forces reacted courageously, but were caught unprepared. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life, scrambling to hit fast-moving targets. Pilots sprinted to their planes, some managing to take off under fire. But the scale of the attack overwhelmed defenses. Fires spread across the harbor, smoke darkened the sky, explosions echoed across the island. Less than 2 hours later, the second wave struck, inflicting further damage. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The results were devastating. 4 battleships were sunk, 4 more damaged. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, with thousands more wounded. Pearl Harbor was left smoldering, its fleet crippled. But the attack had also failed in several key objectives. The American aircraft carriers, considered the most important targets, were not in the harbor. They had departed earlier for other operations. Oil storage tanks, repair facilities, and submarine bases, critical for long-term naval operations, were also left largely untouched. These oversights would later prove crucial. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the news with shock, but also clarity. The attack unified public opinion instantly. On December 8th, Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling the previous day a date which will live in infamy. War was declared with near unanimous support. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States soon afterward. America, which had remained officially neutral for over 2 years, now entered the global conflict with full force. For Japan, the attack initially seemed like a triumph. In the following months, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong fell. The Philippines were invaded. Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies collapsed under rapid assault. Japanese commanders believed they had achieved their strategic goals, crippling American naval power and securing resource-rich territories. But Yamamoto's warning soon proved prophetic. The United States, fueled by industrial capacity unparalleled in world history, mobilized rapidly. Shipyards expanded output dramatically. Factories shifted to wartime production. Millions of Americans enlisted. Aircraft, ships, and weapons flowed from assembly lines in staggering numbers. The nation that had been attacked now mobilized for a long, relentless campaign to push back across the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor reshaped global alliances as well. Britain, already at war with Germany and Japan, welcomed the United States into the conflict. The Soviet Union, though fighting desperately against Germany in the West, gained a new partner who would soon help relieve pressure. China, locked in brutal war with Japan, received increased American support.
The war, once fragmented across continents, had become truly global. The consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military strategy. American society transformed in response. Civilian industries converted to military production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the government expanded its power to coordinate the war effort. In a darker development, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forcibly relocated to internment camps, one of the gravest civil liberties violations in U.S. history. Yet perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. Before Pearl Harbor, American public opinion had been divided. Many preferred to stay out of overseas conflicts. After December 7th, that debate vanished. The attack unified the nation with a shared sense of purpose and resolve. For Japan, the hope that Americans would seek a quick peace vanished forever. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific entered a new phase. Japanese forces still held the initiative, but American submarines were beginning to disrupt supply lines. Carrier groups prepared for future engagements. Battles that would shape the entire war, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, were on the horizon. The Pacific had ignited, and the world would never be the same.
By early 1942, the Axis powers appeared to dominate vast regions of the world. Germany controlled most of continental Europe and had driven deep into the Soviet Union. Japan had conquered territories stretching from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Italy, though weaker militarily, maintained footholds in North Africa. Yet beneath the surface of these triumphs, cracks had begun to form. Strategic miscalculations, stretched supply lines, and a growing coalition of determined allied nations. What followed in 1942 and 1943 would reshape the entire war. Across 3 decisive fronts, the Pacific, the Eastern Front, and North Africa, the tide would turn. The first decisive shift came in the Pacific, near a small, isolated string of islands northwest of Hawaii. Midway Atoll, though tiny, held enormous strategic value. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan sought to lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a trap. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto envisioned a grand encirclement. Strike Midway, force the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond, and then crush American carriers with superior numbers. If the operation succeeded, Japanese domination across the Pacific would be assured. But the Japanese command did not know that American intelligence had already broken major parts of their naval code. U.S. cryptanalysts discovered that AF, the operation's target, referred to Midway. By late May 1942, American Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the date, approximate composition, and direction of the Japanese attack. Instead of being surprised, the Americans set an ambush of their own. On June 4th, as Japanese carriers launched waves of aircraft against Midway's defenses, American bombers and torpedo squadrons attacked their fleet. The early waves of American torpedo planes suffered catastrophic losses. Many pilots were shot down without landing a hit. But their sacrifice disrupted Japanese fighter cover and created a critical opening. Minutes later, American dive bombers arrived overhead. With Japanese decks crowded with refueling aircraft and munitions, the bombs struck with devastating effect. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames within minutes. Later that afternoon, a 4th carrier, Hiryu, was also destroyed. In a single day, Japan lost not only 4 frontline carriers, but also hundreds of aircraft and many of its most experienced pilots. For Japan, these losses were irreplaceable. Its pilot training programs could not rebuild the elite squadrons wiped out over Midway. For the United States, the victory provided a massive psychological shift. The Pacific War, once a desperate defensive struggle, had now entered a new phase where American forces could push back.
But while Midway marked a turning point in naval warfare, a far larger and bloodier struggle raged across the Eastern Front. By mid-1942, Germany sought to regain momentum after the failure to capture Moscow. Hitler redirected German strategy toward the southern Soviet Union, aiming to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. These resources were vital. Without oil, Germany's mechanized army could not sustain large-scale operations. The campaign began well for the Germans. Army Group South advanced rapidly across the steppe, capturing vast territories and pushing Soviet forces back toward the Volga River. But instead of focusing on the oil fields alone, Hitler split his forces, ordering a simultaneous push toward the city of Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial hub that bore the name of the Soviet leader. For Hitler, taking this city held symbolic significance, and he believed its capture would shatter Soviet morale. In August 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city, situated along the Volga, became the focal point of one of the most brutal urban battles in history. From the beginning, the fight defied conventional tactics. German aircraft bombed the city extensively, turning entire districts into rubble. Yet this destruction worked against them. The ruins created natural fortifications, enabling Soviet defenders to fight from basements, factories, and collapsed buildings. For months, fierce combat consumed every street, every block, every room. The Volga River served as the Soviets' lifeline. Under constant artillery fire, small boats transported reinforcements at night. Soviet snipers prowled the ruins, targeting German officers. Machine gun nests emerged from concealed positions. Grenades and bayonets became as common as rifles. The front line was often measured in meters, with neither side willing to retreat. As autumn turned to winter, a dramatic shift occurred. While German forces were bogged down in the destroyed city, the Soviets prepared a massive counteroffensive. Their plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, aimed not at retaking the city directly, but at encircling it. The northern and southern flanks of the German Sixth Army were held by weaker Romanian units, poorly equipped for winter warfare and lacking anti-tank defenses. On November 19, 1942, Soviet armored formations thundered across the frozen steppes, overwhelming these positions and driving deep behind German lines. Within days, the German Sixth Army found itself completely encircled. Hitler ordered the troops to hold their positions, promising that an airlift would sustain them. But the Luftwaffe could not deliver even a fraction of the required supplies.
Soldiers froze in trenches and cellars. Ammunition dwindled. Starvation spread. Soviet forces tightened the noose as temperatures plunged far below freezing. By January 1943, the situation was hopeless. German units, reduced by hunger, disease, and constant assault, surrendered in waves. On February 2nd, the last remnants gave up. The battle had lasted more than 5 months. The Germans suffered nearly 1 million casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet push westward. Yet while Europe and the Pacific saw decisive clashes, another critical front was unfolding across the deserts and coasts of North Africa. Since 1940, Britain and Italy had fought over Libya and Egypt. Italy, seeking to expand its influence, invaded Egypt from Libya, only to be pushed back by British Commonwealth forces. In early 1941, Germany intervened to rescue its ally, sending a mechanized force under General Erwin Rommel. The Afrika Korps, as it became known, quickly developed a fierce reputation. Rommel used speed, surprise, and aggressive maneuvering to outflank British positions. He became known as the Desert Fox, admired even by adversaries for his tactical brilliance. Throughout 1941 and early 1942, the Desert War seesawed back and forth. Cities such as Tobruk changed hands. Supply lines stretched across vast wastelands. Heat, sandstorms, and vehicle breakdowns were constant challenges. By mid-1942, Rommel launched a major offensive, pushing deep into Egypt. His goal was to seize the Suez Canal, cutting Britain's vital link to its empire. Only one defensive line remained between Axis forces and this strategic prize, a railway halt known as El Alamein. Here, the British Eighth Army made its stand. In August 1942, General Bernard Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army. Methodical, cautious, and focused, Montgomery reorganized his forces, prepared fresh defensive positions, and waited for reinforcements. Throughout September and October, Allied factories and ports delivered new tanks, artillery, and supplies. For the first time in the Desert War, the British held a decisive advantage in equipment and logistics. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched his offensive. Massive artillery barrages lit up the desert night. Infantry divisions advanced through minefields under heavy fire. Armored units clashed across open plains. Rommel, ill and temporarily away in Europe, returned urgently to find his forces struggling. Despite fierce resistance, German and Italian units gradually fell back. Their supplies were dwindling, and Allied naval superiority made resupply increasingly impossible. By November 11th, the Axis retreat became a collapse. Rommel withdrew along the coast, attempting to save what remained of his army. The British pursued relentlessly, reclaiming Libya and forcing the Afrika Korps into Tunisia. At the same time, another major Allied operation unfolded, the American and British landings in North Africa, known as Operation Torch. In November 1942, Allied forces landed in French-controlled Morocco and Algeria. After initial confusion and resistance from Vichy French forces, the Allies secured the region. Axis forces in North Africa now faced a two-front assault, from the west by American forces and from the east by the British. By May 1943, the Axis position in North Africa had collapsed completely. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. The entire region, from Morocco to Egypt, was now in Allied hands. This victory opened the Mediterranean for Allied shipping, provided new bases for future operations, and eliminated a major threat to the Suez Canal. Midway, Stalingrad, and North Africa, all occurring within a period of 12 months, dramatically altered the course of the war. Each battle carried its own unique geography, strategies, and human stories, yet all shared underlying themes: overstretched Axis ambitions,
determined Allied resistance and the growing power of coordinated global warfare. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway halted Japan's expansion and shifted naval supremacy toward the United States. The American industrial engine, awakened by Pearl Harbor, now began converting its capacity into aircraft carriers, submarines, and bombers that would relentlessly push across the ocean. In the Eastern Front, Stalingrad shattered the idea of a quick German victory. The Soviet Union demonstrated extraordinary resilience, mobilizing massive armies, relocating entire industries, and using its vast geography as a defensive weapon. The Red Army, once struggling to survive, now gained confidence and momentum. In North Africa, the Allied victory eliminated the Axis presence, secured vital shipping lanes, and opened the way for invasions of Sicily and Italy.
The United States, still relatively new to the war, gained crucial battlefield experience and forged stronger cooperation with British forces. The turning of the tide in 1942-1943 was not a single moment, but a convergence of events, each one weakening the Axis, strengthening the Allies, and shifting the balance of power. Germany, once triumphant, now faced a grinding war on multiple fronts. Japan, once dominant, now confronted the full industrial might of the United States. As 1943 progressed, the Allied momentum only increased. The war was far from over, but its outcome had taken shape. The Axis powers no longer dictated the course of events. Instead, they reacted, struggling to defend an overstretched empire as the Allies advanced from the seas, the skies, and the continents. The tide had finally turned, and the world was moving toward the final, decisive chapters of the conflict.
By mid-1943, the tide of World War II had unmistakably shifted. The Axis powers, once advancing with unstoppable momentum, were now on the defensive across every major front. Their armies were stretched thin, their supply lines overextended, and their strategic advantages fading. The Allies, strengthened by industrial production, renewed confidence, and unified leadership, recognized that the time had come to move from containment to liberation. The next phase of the war would unfold in the Mediterranean, across the rugged mountains of Italy, and ultimately on the shores of France in the most ambitious amphibious assault in history. The first major step began with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Known as Operation Husky, the assault represented the first large-scale collaboration between American, British, and Canadian forces in a European theater. Sicily, positioned at the southern gateway to Italy, offered an ideal target. Capturing the island would weaken Mussolini's regime, secure Allied shipping routes in the Mediterranean, and provide bases for future operations on the Italian mainland. On the night of July 9th, Allied paratroopers descended across the island, while amphibious landings began at dawn. The invasion force was immense, over 150,000 troops, supported by naval bombardment and aircraft. The Axis defenders, comprised of German and Italian forces, fought fiercely, but morale among Italian soldiers had been declining for months. By late July, Allied forces pushed through the mountainous interior and captured key cities. Palermo fell, and Axis troops began withdrawing toward the Strait of Messina. German units fought delaying actions to cover the evacuation, enabling thousands of troops to escape to mainland Italy. Yet the strategic consequences of Sicily extended far beyond the battlefield. The defeats suffered there further discredited Italy's fascist leadership. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was deposed by his own Grand Council. King Victor Emmanuel III ordered his arrest and appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio to form a new government. Although Badoglio initially declared that Italy would continue fighting alongside Germany, secret negotiations with the Allies soon began. The collapse of Mussolini's regime shook Berlin. Hitler, unwilling to lose control of the Mediterranean, immediately dispatched troops to occupy key regions in Italy. German forces moved swiftly, seizing northern and central Italy, securing defensive positions, and preparing to resist the expected Allied invasion. For Germany, Italy transformed from an unreliable ally into an occupied territory that demanded significant resources to defend.
Meanwhile, the Allies prepared for the next phase, invading mainland Italy. The first landings occurred at Salerno, Taranto, and Calabria in September 1943. The operation was complex. Italy, now divided between the new government in the south and German-controlled territory in the north, announced an armistice with the Allies on September 8th. But German forces anticipated this move and quickly disarmed Italian troops across the peninsula. The result was a chaotic transition, with Italian soldiers trapped between shifting allegiances and German retaliation. The landings at Salerno met fierce German resistance. The rugged Italian terrain, mountains, rivers, narrow valleys favored defenders, and German divisions fought with determination under General Albert Kesselring. Despite difficult conditions, the Allies secured the beachhead and pushed north. Naples fell in October after a bitter battle and a spontaneous uprising by local citizens. Yet progress slowed as the Allies encountered the Gustav Line, a formidable German defensive barrier anchored by the mountain monastery of Monte Cassino. The battle for Monte Cassino became one of the most grueling of the Italian campaign. Over several months, Allied forces from many nations, Americans, British, Poles, New Zealanders, French, Indians, Moroccans, launched repeated assaults through rain, mud, snow, and entrenched German defenses. The monastery, though initially unoccupied by German troops, became a symbol of the struggle. In February 1944, Allied bombers destroyed it, believing it to be an observation post. The ruins, however, became even more defensible for German paratroopers. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought through the harsh terrain, often gaining only a few miles after weeks of battle. The cost was staggering, but in May 1944, a renewed offensive, Operation Diadem, finally broke the Gustav Line. The Polish Second Corps captured the ruins of Monte Cassino, raising their flag over the shattered monastery. German forces retreated northward, and Allied troops finally liberated Rome on June 4, 1944.
Yet, even as Italy's capital fell, a far larger operation was already underway elsewhere. Italy's campaign, though important, was not the decisive theater that would break Nazi Germany. That role belonged to the Western Front. The Allies had been planning its opening for years, and in 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed to launch a massive assault across the English Channel in 1944. The goal? Open a second major front in Western Europe, relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, and begin the liberation of France. Planning for what would become Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, required extraordinary coordination. It involved not only the United States and Britain, but also Canadian, Polish, Norwegian, French, and other Allied units. Logistics were immense. Thousands of ships had to be assembled. New technologies, such as specialized tanks designed for beach landings, were developed. Extensive training camps in southern England prepared troops for amphibious assault. A key element of the plan was deception. The Allies sought to convince Germany that the invasion would occur at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. To achieve this, they created a fictional army group under General George Patton, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and dummy landing craft. German intelligence intercepted these signals and remained convinced that Pas de Calais was the primary target. Meanwhile, the real invasion force gathered in secret.
Tens of thousands of troops waited in ports and camps, while commanders debated weather forecasts and landing schedules. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower carried the enormous burden of deciding when to launch the operation. After several delays due to storms, he approved June 6, 1944, as the date for the assault.
In the early hours of that morning, darkness covered the English Channel. The sea was choppy, the wind uncertain, and the clouds heavy. Yet across the water, an armada of nearly 5,000 ships, warships, transports, landing craft moved toward the French coast. Above them, thousands of aircraft carried paratroopers and gliders who would land behind German lines to secure bridges, disrupt communications, and sow confusion. The first Allied units to touch French soil that day were airborne divisions. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Divisions descended near Normandy villages, scattered by wind and anti-aircraft fire. British and Canadian airborne units landed near the eastern flank, capturing key bridges in daring nighttime assaults. Though many units were misdropped, they fought with determination, creating pockets of resistance that disrupted German reinforcements. At dawn, the main landings began. 5 beaches were targeted: Utah and Omaha by American forces, Gold and Sword by the British, and Juneau by the Canadians. Each beach faced different defenses, shaped by tides, terrain, and German fortifications. The German coastal defense network, known as the Atlantic Wall, featured bunkers, mines, artillery positions, machine gun nests, and obstacles designed to tear apart landing craft. At Utah Beach, American forces landed off course due to strong currents, but the mistake proved beneficial. They encountered lighter resistance and moved inland quickly. At Gold and Sword, British troops pushed through well-defended positions and captured key towns, linking their beachheads by the end of the day. The Canadians at Juneau faced fierce opposition, but fought their way ashore, advancing deeper inland than any other force. The bloodiest fighting occurred at Omaha Beach. German units positioned in high cliffs and fortified bunkers created deadly crossfire zones. Landing craft were struck by artillery. Troops waded through surf under machine gun fire. Casualties were severe. But through sheer determination, small groups of soldiers broke through the defenses, scaling cliffs, destroying bunkers, and opening routes inland. By nightfall on June 6th, over 156,000 Allied troops had reached the beaches of Normandy. Though the fighting had only begun, the landings were a success. The beachheads held. German defenders, confused by deception plans, delayed reinforcements. The second front that Stalin had long demanded was finally open. The battle for Normandy continued for weeks. Hedgerows, small fields enclosed by thick earthen walls, turned the countryside into a maze ideal for defenders. German armored divisions counterattacked repeatedly, including the feared Panzer Lehr and SS units. Casualties mounted on both sides. The city of Caen, a major objective for the British, took more than a month to capture. As July progressed, the Allies gradually wore down German defenses. The sheer weight of Allied air power, artillery, and manpower tipped the balance. Operation Cobra, launched by American forces in late July, broke through German lines west of Saint-Lô. Tanks and infantry surged forward, exploiting gaps in the enemy defenses. German units began to collapse. By August, the Allies encircled German forces in the Falaise pocket. Thousands were killed or captured. The remnants of German divisions retreated eastward, abandoning equipment in their haste. The road to Paris now lay open. On August 25, 1944, French and American troops entered Paris. The city erupted in celebration. The German garrison, defying Hitler's orders to destroy the city, surrendered. News of Paris's liberation resounded worldwide, symbolizing the return of freedom to Western Europe. The Allied advance continued across France and Belgium, liberating town after town. The once invincible German military struggled to recover from the twin disasters of Normandy and the Eastern Front. Supplies ran short, morale plummeted. The Third Reich, which had once dominated Europe, now faced relentless pressure from multiple directions. Yet the war was not close to ending. Germany would fight fiercely in the months ahead, launching one final major counteroffensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge. But its fate was sealed. The Allies had crossed into France, broken the Atlantic Wall, and opened the path to the heart of Europe. The years 1943 and 1944 marked the transformation of the war from defensive survival to offensive momentum. Italy's collapse removed a major Axis ally. Sicily provided a launch pad. Monte Cassino showed the cost of fighting through fortified mountainous terrain. And Normandy demonstrated the Allies' ability to coordinate massive operations with precision. These victories were not just military triumphs, they were symbols. They showed occupied nations that liberation was coming. They proved that even the strongest dictatorships could be reversed, and they set the stage for the final push into Germany, where the war would enter its last and most dramatic chapter. By the beginning of 1945, the world's deadliest conflict had entered its final, brutal chapter. The Axis powers, once dominating vast regions across two continents, were now trapped in a tightening ring of Allied encirclement. Germany was collapsing from the west and the east, its cities reduced to rubble by relentless bombardment, its armies shattered, and its leadership isolated in a world of delusion. In the Pacific, Japan faced steady but relentless Allied advances, losing territory, ships, aircraft, and the industrial resources needed to continue the war. Yet neither nation surrendered quickly. What unfolded over the final year of the war was a struggle defined by desperation, staggering casualties, and the determination of millions to end the conflict once and for all. The collapse of Germany began accelerating in late 1944. After the Allied landings in Normandy and their breakout across France, German forces attempted one final counterattack in the west, the Battle of the Bulge. Launched in December 1944, it was a last gamble to split American and British forces, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement. The attack initially caught the Allies off guard, pushing deep into the Ardennes, but fuel shortages, stiff resistance, and overwhelming Allied air power turned the tide. By mid-January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. It was Germany's last major operation in the West. In the East, the Soviet Red Army continued its relentless advance. After breaking the siege of Leningrad, winning at Kursk, and recapturing Ukraine, Soviet forces began pushing through Poland and the Baltic states. In January 1945, they launched one of the largest offensives of the war, the Vistula-Oder offensive, driving from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River, just 60 miles from Berlin, in a matter of weeks. German defenses crumbled under the sheer weight of Soviet manpower, artillery, and armor. Germany's cities suffered heavily during this time. Allied bombing campaigns throughout 1944 and early 1945 targeted industrial sites, railways, and urban centers. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Kassel, and many more cities lay devastated. Dresden, bombed in February 1945, became one of the most controversial raids of the war due to the enormous destruction and civilian casualties. Across the Reich, millions of people lived in basements, shelters, and ruins, struggling to survive amid hunger, cold, and chaos. As the Allies advanced, they uncovered the horrific evidence of Nazi crimes. In Poland, during the summer and autumn of 1944, Soviet troops liberated the first major concentration and extermination camps, Majdanek and Treblinka.
In January 1945, they reached Auschwitz. American and British troops later liberated camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The revelations stunned the world. The scale of the Holocaust, systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, became undeniable.
Meanwhile, Germany's political leadership retreated into isolation. Adolf Hitler, surrounded by loyalists, moved into the underground Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He refused to acknowledge the approaching collapse, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed and dreaming of counterattacks that were impossible. Reality was replaced by delusion, and those around him feared to challenge his increasingly erratic decisions. By March 1945, American forces crossed the Rhine River, one of Germany's last major natural barriers. At Remagen, U.S. troops captured an intact bridge, enabling a rapid advance into the heart of Germany. British and Canadian forces pushed through northern Germany, liberating the Netherlands and moving toward the Baltic coast. French forces advanced along the Rhine as well, reclaiming territory lost early in the war. In the east, the Soviets prepared for their final assault on Berlin. The Battle of Berlin would be one of the largest urban battles of the war, involving over 2 million soldiers on both sides. In April 1945, the Red Army launched its final push. Fighting was fierce. German soldiers, Volkssturm militia, and even teenagers and elderly civilians defended the city, though their resistance could not alter the outcome. Soviet forces attacked from multiple directions, breaking through outer defenses and pushing toward the city center. Street by street, block by block, Berlin became a battleground. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Tanks fired at close range. Civilian casualties mounted as food and water became scarce. Fires spread uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. In the bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler refused to leave. He raged at generals who had no troops left, blamed traitors for defeats, and clung to fantasies of salvation. But as Soviet troops closed in, even he could no longer deny the inevitable. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His inner circle began attempts to flee or negotiate surrender. On May 2nd, Berlin fell. German forces in the city surrendered. Across Europe, remaining German units laid down their arms. On May 7th, near Reims, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. It took effect on May 8, 1945, a day remembered as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. After nearly 6 years of war in Europe, the fighting was over. But the world was still at war. Japan continued to fight, and the final phase of the conflict in the Pacific promised to be even more violent.
Since 1943, the Allies had pursued a strategy known as island hopping, capturing strategic islands while bypassing others, slowly pushing closer to the Japanese mainland. The battles were brutal. On Guadalcanal, American forces fought months-long campaigns in jungles and swamps. In the Central Pacific, the invasions of Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, and the Marianas brought intense fighting and heavy casualties. The capture of the Marianas in 1944 allowed American B-29 bombers to strike Japan directly. Cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe suffered massive firebombing raids. Wooden urban neighborhoods were particularly vulnerable. In March 1945, a firebombing raid on Tokyo killed tens of thousands in a single night. Japanese industries were crippled, but the government refused to surrender. The battles grew even more deadly as the Allies approached Japan. In October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a massive naval engagement, destroyed much of Japan's remaining navy. On Iwo Jima, American Marines fought one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, capturing an island that would serve as a vital emergency landing site for bombers. The iconic image of Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi came from this battle,
But behind the image lay immense sacrifice, nearly 7,000 Americans killed and more than 20,000 Japanese defenders dead. Then came Okinawa. The invasion of Okinawa in April 1945 marked the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The island, located just 350 miles from the Japanese mainland, was defended by well-prepared Japanese forces. The battle lasted nearly 3 months. Fighting was savage, with rain-soaked hills, caves, and fortifications, turning the island into a nightmare of mud, death, and exhaustion. Japanese kamikaze attacks, suicide missions using explosive-laden aircraft, inflicted heavy damage on Allied ships. On land, Japanese defenders launched desperate nighttime assaults, often fighting to the last man. Civilian casualties were also immense, as Okinawan civilians were caught between armies or coerced by Japanese officers into dying rather than surrendering. By June 1945, Okinawa fell, but the cost was horrifying. More than 12,000 Americans killed, tens of thousands wounded, and well over 100,000 Japanese military and civilian deaths. The battle convinced American planners that an invasion of the Japanese mainland, codenamed Operation Downfall, would result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. Estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to potentially millions. The Japanese government, led by militarists who believed surrender would dishonor the nation, prepared for total war. Civilians trained with bamboo spears. Schoolchildren drilled for guerrilla resistance. Factories prepared weapons for a last-ditch defense. Japan still possessed millions of soldiers across its empire, and despite devastating losses, its leaders showed no intention of surrendering. At this critical moment, the United States made a decision that would change the course of history. Since 1942, American scientists had been working on the Manhattan Project, a secret effort to build an atomic bomb. By mid-1945, the project succeeded. President Harry S. Truman faced a grim choice: invade Japan and face potentially unprecedented loss of life, or use the new bombs to force surrender. On July 26, 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Japan's leadership, divided between moderates seeking peace and hardliners demanding continued war, did not accept the terms. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion annihilated the city center, flattening thousands of buildings, igniting fires that raged uncontrollably, and killing tens of thousands instantly. Radiation exposure led to immense suffering in the days and weeks afterward. Yet even this catastrophic event did not immediately break the Japanese government's resistance. Hardliners argued for continued war, insisting that Japan could still fight on. On August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. On the same day, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The combined shock, atomic devastation, and the entry of the Soviet Union shattered the remaining arguments for continued resistance. Emperor Hirohito intervened directly. In a rare move, he addressed his government, saying the war must end to prevent the total destruction of the Japanese people. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The world reacted with relief, celebration, and reflection. The scars of war were deep, but peace had finally arrived. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally signed the Instrument of Surrender. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. The final collapse of the Axis powers reshaped the world.
It ended governments built on conquest, racism, and dictatorship. It liberated occupied nations, restored independence to millions, and brought about the birth of the United Nations. It transformed the United States and the Soviet Union into global superpowers. It ushered in a new era of technology, geopolitics, and reconstruction. But above all, it left behind a legacy written in sacrifice. Tens of millions had died, soldiers on distant fronts, civilians in bombed cities, prisoners in camps, families torn apart across continents. Their stories, their grief, and their resilience became part of the world's memory. The war had ended, but its lessons of courage, of tragedy, of unity against tyranny would shape the decades to come.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged into a landscape forever altered by 6 years of conflict. Whole cities lay in ruins, nations were shattered, millions of families searched for loved ones who would never return, and across every continent, the shadow of the war lingered, heavy, unmistakable, unforgettable. Yet even in this devastation, the foundations of a new world began to rise, shaped by memory, reconciliation, and the determination to build a future free from the violence that had consumed an entire generation. The immediate aftermath was both hopeful and painful. In Europe, survivors returned to streets lined with collapsed buildings and empty homes. Countries liberated from occupation faced the monumental task of rebuilding governments, economies, and trust. Germany, the epicenter of destruction and responsibility, was divided into occupation zones administered by the Allied powers. Japan, similarly devastated, began a sweeping transformation under American supervision, shifting from militarism to democracy. The war also forced nations to confront the full truth of the atrocities committed. As Allied armies liberated concentration camps in 1945, the world saw the scale of the Holocaust clearly for the first time. Photographs, testimonies, and evidence presented at the Nuremberg trials revealed crimes so horrific that new terms, including genocide and crimes against humanity, had to be created. These revelations reshaped moral consciousness, inspiring global efforts to protect human rights and prevent such cruelty from ever recurring. At the same time, the war accelerated political shifts that reshaped the global order. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two dominant powers, setting the stage for a new, uneasy rivalry, the Cold War. The old European empires weakened dramatically. Movements for independence surged across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, transforming the international landscape over the next decades. Amid these changes, international cooperation took center stage. Determined to avoid another global catastrophe, nations established the United Nations in 1945. Its mission, to promote peace, security, and human dignity, reflected the harsh lessons learned from unchecked aggression and failed diplomacy. Though imperfect, the UN became a symbol of the world's hope that unity could prevent future wars. Yet the most enduring legacy of World War II lies not in institutions or borders, but in the memory of those who lived through it. Veterans carried stories of courage and trauma. Families preserved letters, photographs, and fragments of the past. Memorials rose in cities and towns to honor the fallen. And each generation since has grappled with the lessons the war left behind, the danger of extremist ideologies, the cost of indifference, the importance of standing against tyranny before it spreads. The world reshaped by World War II was not born from victory alone, but from reflection on the price paid, the mistakes made, and the determination never to repeat them.
In the ruins of 1945, humanity found a reason to rebuild not only homes and nations, but ideals. The war ended, but its lessons remain, guiding us toward a world where peace is not assumed, but protected, and where the memory of the past continues to illuminate the path forward.